So this is my PowerPoint on issues in education. And I've just used a couple of images here. So the image by First Dog on the Moon shows the relationship of government and media views to societal opinion and how these are proliferated in wider society because of problematic leadership influenced by neoliberalism. The second image is a response to a recent statement by Peter Dutton about perceived African gang violence. So the letter writer sees the irony and the danger of blaming one group of people for the problems of society and substitutes the word Anglos in place of Africans to see what it does to the statement. This is an insightful analysis and one perhaps you could teach students about to be critical of the larger systems at play in their education. So this first point talks about the fair go, or the myth of the fair go, and the mythology of countries as proliferated by governments and media. So, for example, Australia Day is, meant to be the date of this discovery of a country, but this precludes and devalues Indigenous people's experiences. The second point is that the language of education is overarchingly middle class, and Bernstein's invisible pedagogy is a useful way to look at the construction of attitudes to schooling by the dominant socio-economic paradigm. So they make the rules and the language by which we measure quality education. The third point is that government policy drives school funding. So my example is that a local Northcote primary school was featured in the Progress Leader newspaper just before the local election as they couldn't afford overdue building work and the building was quite dangerous. So this was a desperate attempt by the school to publicise awareness of the plight of public education and did thankfully result in some funding allocation for building works at this school. It was interesting to learn that, despite government policies which might have thought they were doing the opposite, they've actually increased or reproduced societal and class inequalities rather than reducing them. Also in this reading, I was interested in the Marxist, that conveys the governmental ideals through all the systems, including education and schooling, and literally schools people to conform to the ideals of the government, creating good workers. So the two studies, I enjoyed the Lisa one where it was teaching cultural codes to assist students to see and recognise class and the importance of learning these codes which allows social mobility and educational success within these systems. So speaking about these implicit codes, I tend to think that's a really important thing to mention to teachers, colleagues and students, and it shines a light on the power of these codes and helps us to see what improvements should be made to systems to advocate for equality in all areas. So my attitude at my recent placement was interesting to reflect on, as I did attend an independent school on a scholarship and know it's both parental and good state schooling that has influenced this love of learning. And 8 years of study, I seem to fit into the school system quite well. So in my mind, on my placement, I imagined myself coming to this realisation. Like in my mind, I was saying, "What do you mean you don't love learning?" Posh kind of attitude, which was a funny way to examine my own attitude and how I'll encourage this love of learning in my students. And then the second point is that report writing at this placement wasn't based on grades, but rather on student attitudes to conforming classroom behaviour, which I thought might not have been as effective as more specific feedback based on subject. So the students were graded on 12 aspects of their attitudes according to the subject, which really only gave parents and teachers information about the subjects they were under-engaged in and didn't tell us a lot of specific information about the students' skills. So perhaps done it this way, it's made easier for less literate parents, which is good, but it was a very general way to report on individual talents and student successes. So in regards to point one, I found it striking to read that government changed educational policy regarding student educational visas. Surely having more educated people is a boon if you believe in your education system. High fee paying international students form a big part of educational funding in both universities and high schools as well. The next point, I was thinking about Muslim Australians who've been more recent arrivals, and the fact that males who are Muslim are struggling with literacy could reflect that learning a new culture is also complicated and it takes time and more support than is provided. And then point 3, it's my belief that radicalisation can be driven by governments deliberately or unconsciously through policy, and it's often a result of this alienation or lack of support from society for those young people. Eurocentric colonial history is a huge part of Australian identity and permeates all areas, including that of art history, which is my specialty. So the pluralistic nature of cultural history can be harder to teach outside of that classic The Story of Art by Gombrich, but it is crucial to educating students about all aspects of art in the world and can give insight into other cultures and how they resolve issues or how they represent things, and why it's important to see different examples. So on reflection, I had a recent experience collaborating with Wiradjuri and queer artist Peter Waples-Crowe, which was really enlightening. His generosity with sharing his experience was really the first time I've had a conversation about Indigenous cultural viewpoints with an actual Indigenous person, and I'm 35, I think I was 35 at that point, though I have always had sympathy and some understanding. So this conversational aspect of the collaboration was really powerful and something I must consider including in my classroom. So to have those from a broad range of cultures share their experience to move toward a shared understanding, which includes all history and not just that of the dominant cultural paradigm of Australia. So in this introduction to gender, I just wanted to include a reflection on my school experience, where the students were generally tolerant and corrected themselves if they slipped. One student did use a homophobic slur in front of me, but immediately apologised, and I could tell he knew it was inappropriate. Hopefully it wasn't just because of the appalled look on my face. Hopefully he knew why it was inappropriate. I guess it is possible to turn ugly examples of this kind of speaking into teachable moments and talk about why it's not appropriate. Again, in my field, using examples of artists who are women or who are not heteronormative is a key part of showing students the multidimensional nature of humanity and my respect for a broad range of artists. So leading by example, showing this to show that I have respect. Also, I must remember that while I didn't have an experience being at a school with boys, I might need to learn more about young boys and men to allow me more tolerance with behaviours I don't find as understandable in school. This kind of interlinks with the reading, which mentions that the traditional design of schools and education system based on Industrial Revolution ideals presently seems to be more suited to females. So this is the concept map about the chapter. I guess I want to talk about the impact on the real world and the examples of violence being done against those who don't stick to societal gender norms, such as gay, trans, any women who speak out. I'm thinking about Rosie Batty, those who spoke against Don Burke or Harvey Weinstein. These people can present the trouble some of society has with gender tropes if they are non-standard or non-heteronormative. So this violence can apply to bodies which are not white, which are male, or not white or male or straight or able or middle upper class bodies. An obvious difference is historically difficult for much of society. So here I've got some evidence and examples of gender which impacts female students and people in the world. Anita Sarkeesian, an academic who pointed out movie tropes and uncovered the violent attitudes present online of those who disagreed with her viewpoint. She highlights this problematic lack of safety for women in contemporary internet space and the world. When Sarkeesian made her numerous and anonymous death threats and violent tweets public, all of the kind of hate mail that she got, she was able to show the violent disregard for her right to speak within minimally regulated internet space. This was a response, all of her death threats and things were a response to videos which critiqued the tropes of women in video games. Why this is relevant to teaching is because teaching students about these hidden codes and systems, as we talked about in the socioeconomic section, the kind of hidden codes, that it's important and equitable for women to access game and internet space and to speak about and critique things they are passionate about without harassment or death threats. So here on this slide is another illustration I have about a feminist example. So Elvis Richardson, an Australian artist and researcher, as part of her Countess report, has shown the major discrepancy between women who graduate from art degree courses at universities as compared to women who are represented in major and minor shows or by commercial galleries or in survey exhibitions or selected for art prizes or win art prizes. So this simple process of counting and publishing the number of women in these areas proves a clear gender imbalance in the arts. So it's basically evidence-based practice in the arts about gender. So this is not dissimilar to the reflection of such in education. So most graduate teachers and practising teachers in schools are women, but it's not reflected by the numbers of women in leadership roles in education. So it's hard for students and other teachers to see that it's possible for women to seek these leadership roles. Unconscious bias, available childcare options, confidence levels are some of the reasons I can see which may affect these statistics. So this is just a summary of the issues and the relevant considerations for educational professionals. And I, noticed in the Jeff Masters article, I was particularly intrigued by a comment from a teacher about NAPLAN tests, and the problematic nature of this from the teacher's perspective is that the teachers already know the student's not very good at reading or writing. The problem is more that the teacher has no extra resources to give attention to the student and is taken over by further administration and reporting when what is needed is time spent with the student, whether that's with the teacher and the student one-on-one or an extra professional. This commenter also warned about confirmation bias when correlating cause to effect in teaching and in research. Another thing this commenter noticed, so I thought it was a pretty pithy response, is that teachers are often cited as the cause for educational failures or, non-successes. And my suspicion is that the one thing government's policy makers and principals feel they can change is teachers. And teachers are blamed because they're only the middle third of graduates in this article, which is still a very educationally advantaged and specialised group, rather than investigating deeply around whether testing helps students or teachers educate better. It's simpler and easier to kind of blame a teacher. So I guess in summary, as a professional, it's important to keep up with relevant critical thinking, have conversations, and make sure not to essentialise any of the areas of that we've been looking at, because all of this has a complex, interlinked interplay. Thank you.